Alright, hello friends. Today's book bro review is a little different than usual because I am going to be discussing two books that cover one subject. The first book, Robert Plant, The Voice That Sailed Led Zeppelin by Dave Thompson. Second book, Robert Plant, A Life by Paul Rees. So I am actually not I wasn't a Robert Plant fan, nor was I really a Zeppelin fan. I didn't dislike them by any means, but they just weren't my cup of tea. Robert Plant, I think, has maybe the most killer voice in rock history, but for some reason Zeppelin just never really, it wasn't my kind of music for whatever reason. And I have been interested in Jimmy Page, mainly because of his occult interests, which I just find really fascinating and strange. And I've read quite a bit about that. But other than that, Zeppelin wasn't really my thing, and so I never really dug too much into it. The reason why I read both these books is because I write for a music site, and I was asked to do a deep dive into Robert Plant's life and his music to get some information to write about. And so that's what I did. I read a couple of these books. I mean, I read stuff all over, but these are the two books that I read cover to cover. And I came away with a lot of surprises. I think a lot of people who aren't hardcore Zeppelin fans, I always thought of Robert Plant as being kind of, honestly, just a good-looking pretty boy who had a killer voice. I don't know why that is. I always assumed Jimmy Page was the real creative driving force behind the band, and I always thought Robert Plant was more the pretty face with a killer voice. Probably just got up on stage and sang. That's completely inaccurate, and that's the biggest surprise that I took away, and the thing that has made me a Robert Plant fan. So Robert Plant is without a doubt a true artist, and by true artist I mean like an artist with a capital A. The way I define a true artist is I think of artists as people whose art embodies their art, for whom their art is a part of their life, whether or not they are actively making money at it. To me, an artist is somebody who would be creating in whatever their medium is, regardless of whether or not they did it for a living. I just think of true artists as people who live their art every day. And Robert Plant is that. He is without a doubt that. The thing that brought this home to me the most was the story of the Charlie Patton Highway. It's a song that he did. It's a great song. It's one of my favorite Plant songs. His singing in it is amazing, even by Plant standards. The guy has a legendary voice in rock and roll. But I think his vocal work in that song is some of his best. It's just his most emotive and raw and authentic and sincere feeling singing that I've ever heard from Plant. But the story behind the song is also interesting because the way it came about was that Plant was working with a university down south. I think it was the University of Alabama, but I could be wrong about that. It was one of the southern universities, and what they were doing was they were setting up blues markers, or markers for blues music history. They were actually setting up physical markers. And so Plant volunteered to help them with this. And I mean, how cool is that? How cool is that? This, multi-millionaire, one of the biggest music celebrities in history, and he volunteers to help this university with that. I thought that was really cool. And rock and roll came out of the blues, and a lot of the old school rockers, like the Robert Plants, the Bob Dylans, all those guys, if you listen to them, they talk with reverence about the blues, because the blues preceded what we came to know of as rock and roll. I mean, they had Elvis in there, who was kind of the bridge between them, and Elvis was a hero to all of them too. But they hold the old blues songs in a very high regard, because they're the foundation of rock and roll, but they're also largely the musicians and the songs that inspire them personally to become musicians. And so, Plant volunteers to help out with this university to place these historical markers, which I just think is so cool. And then he's driving around south. Charlie Patton was a great old blues artist, and there's a stretch of road informally called the Charlie Patton Highway. And Plant was down there setting up these markers, and he was driving around by himself, which is another thing I find fascinating. I mean, here's Plant, this megastar, very wealthy guy, and he's actually driving himself around on his own in his car. I just found that fascinating. But and so while he was driving around, he was listening to the evangelical music from the fire and brimstone Southern evangelical preachers, which, remember, Plant is British, so that's even more of a culture shock than it would be for Americans who aren't from the South. And he was so moved and kind of freaked out by it that he pulled his car over, got out, and started scribbling down the lyrics to Charlie Patton Highway. It shows, number one, the guy is a true artist. Number two, I mean, it's a level of humility that I wouldn't expect from a guy like him, going around, traveling around, helping a university, volunteering his time to help with this. And it just shows that he is a deep, intelligent, philosophical, and insightful person. He's not just the pretty-faced womanizer that he's often portrayed as. And then as far as the whole womanizing thing goes, that's more that's an interesting aspect too, because and I'm not trying to be bashing on womanizing or whatever, which is I think a way that we perceive it now that people didn't perceive it then. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is my impression from reading the books is that more than anything, Plant was a romantic at heart. I mean, he's kind of a big softy when it comes, or that's how it appears to me reading about him. He's kind of a big softy when it comes to women. Yes, obviously he likes to indulge, but he also strikes me as like a legitimately good guy who almost kind of falls in love on a micro level really easily, and that gets him into some trouble, and also gets him into some great adventures, right? I don't get the impression that any of the women minded his approach, but anyway, so yeah, he's a much more complex, interesting, intelligent, philosophical, introspective, insightful person than I ever would have guessed that he was. He's not just a pretty face with a great voice. I would say that's probably my biggest take. Oh, and then another interesting aspect. So when he left Zeppelin, that's a huge shadow for somebody to live under. Zeppelin's, generally considered, Zeppelin and the Stones are generally considered the two greatest rock and roll bands of all time. And so that's a huge shadow for Plant to try to live under. But I mean, he could have humped that for the rest of his career. He could have been the Zeppelin frontman guy. But he chose not to. In those early 80s when he struck out and did his solo work, he specifically wanted to separate himself from that Zeppelin image. He wanted to create something of his own, even going so far as to battling with executives who wanted him to do something like Zeppelin because they wanted him to hump that success and bring it into his new thing. But he refused, insisted on doing his own thing, which I think is very admirable. I think that's very respectable. Once again, it goes back to Plant is a true artist, and he's a man of his own. And so I came away with a much greater respect for him. And again, I just want to reiterate, I never knew much about Plant. I just had a very surface impression from him because I was not a Plant or a Zeppelin fan. I do definitely now consider myself a Plant fan. I've learned to appreciate his music. A lot of his solo stuff is great. He came in the early 80s, and he really wanted to be one of the trailblazers to trailblaze what has become known as the 80s sound, which is unfortunate in a lot of ways because that 80s sound is kind of mocked, and it's kind of the butt of endless jokes nowadays. But there was no way for them really to know that at the time. He was trying to experiment with things and do new things with the new instrumentation and the new mixing technologies that were available, all this kind of stuff. They were just reaching for a different sound. And so now a lot of his solo stuff, it sounds pretty dated. I mean, it sounds plainly and clearly like 80s music. But he's got a lot of great stuff, even from that 80s period. I mean, a lot of that music was really solid. And I think especially after that, after they started to move out of that 80s sound, which has now become so dated, and it's kind of like a novelty. When he came out of that, he started making some really, really good music after that as well. So he's had an interesting legacy, an interesting life, and he's an interesting artist, and I did not anticipate coming away with that impression when I looked into his life. And so anyway, Book Bro review. I recommend both of these books. One thing that I had a problem with this about, which won't affect a general reader, it affected me as somebody who is using it as reference, for using it to learn, take notes, and use reference material. It has a pretty poor index. Specifically, you can't find the specific songs that you want, which is really inconvenient and almost like kind of inexplicable to me. It kind of seems natural for a publisher to include an in-depth index that links to specific songs when they're working with an artist. That is the one flaw in this. And there's also the way the information is structured is really interesting, and at times it didn't work so well for me. But still, overall, it's an excellent book. And also as a physical artifact, it's a beautiful book. It's just the binding, the typeface. It's got this really nice. This is only going to matter to people who are like real book nerds like me. It's got this beautiful purple inside cover. It's thick. It's like a sturdy book. This book was built to last. Everything on it is high quality. I just think as a physical artifact, it's a beautiful book. I don't have the hardcover version for this one, so I can't make the same analysis of the book as a physical artifact. But I really like Reese's writing. Reese, I assume is how you pronounce it, Paul Reese. He's got a very elegant and simple writing style that flows nicely, and I really admired the writing in this book, and it was an easy read from cover to cover. And I would definitely recommend this one as well. And if you're into pictures, it's got some good pictures of Plant back in the day. And so, yes, these are both excellent books. I find a lot of surprising information about Plant. I would recommend checking them out if you're interested in Robert Plant, or if you just like reading biographies of exceptional people or people who have done exceptional things. Go for it. Good stuff. And that's it. That is the Book Bro review for the day.